with a scythe had sharp points where the stems were sliced at an angle. When they were dried, these points got as hard as sharpened pencils, and when we stirred in sleep, we kept waking up. Dried ferns also have a way of compacting into hard lumps in no time, and even violent shaking won't prevent them from clumping and setting as hard as concrete. These humps ensured that in all my childhood I never once slept on a flat surface. In winter it got so cold sometimes at night that our blankets, which we pulled over our heads, actually froze hard where we left room to breathe. The little chamber was so small that there was only room for a stool between the bunk beds and the far wall. Above the top bunk, right under the ceiling, was a board on which apples were kept. The room always smelled of those apples. They shriveled up in winter and froze as well, but once thawed out, they were still edible. There was almost no medical care, and my mother, having a doctorate to her name, was persistently taken for a medical doctor despite repeated attempts to explain. She was a biologist. Her supervisor was the future Nobel laureate Carl von Frisch. Her thesis was on the hearing of fish. In the lab aquarium, she played tunes on her flute to which the fish learned to respond, either fleeing or curiously coming to the surface, because after one of the tunes there was food as a reward. She kept being called out in village emergencies. A boy next door, 4 years old, had stood up on tiptoe to take a big cauldron off the hearth. The cauldron tipped over and boiling water scalded him from the point of his chin and his throat all the way down to his thighs. The burns were horrific, and my mother was called when the boy's heart had stopped beating. She was not squeamish and jammed an adrenaline injection between his ribs straight into his heart. He lived. Years later, he once took off his shirt in class and showed me his scarred upper body. There was a lot of infant mortality. On the Berger farm, Beni, the young farmer, and Rosel, his wife, lost one infant after the other right after they were born. They suffered from being in incompatible blood groups, a condition that an immediate mass transfusion can cure nowadays. Finally, they adopted a girl, the offspring of a soldier in the occupying forces, by the name of Brigitte. She was among the gang of children that played around the Berger farm. I remember that Rosel fell pregnant again and gave birth to another child in Aschau and was driven home in a car. I wondered where the baby was. Then Brigitte came crying out of the farmhouse, plunged her head into the trough, and washed her face in cold water. That way I learned that this child too had died, the 8th one. Later there was to be one son who lived, Benno, with whom I am still in touch today. Brigitte became a waitress in a cafe in Aschau, but died very young from breast cancer. My brother Till and I grew up in extreme poverty, but we never even knew we were poor, except perhaps in the first 2 or 3 years after the end of the war. We were simply always hungry, and my mother was unable to produce enough food for us. We ate salad from dandelion leaves. My mother made syrups from ribwort and fresh pine shoots. The former was more a house remedy for coughs and colds, and the latter stood in for sugar. Once a week, there was a longish loaf of bread from the village baker, purchased with our ration coupons. With the point of a knife, our mother scratched a mark in it for each day, Monday to Sunday, allowing about a slice of bread for each of us. When hunger got to be very bad, we were each given a piece from the next day's ration, because my mother hoped something might turn up in the meantime, but generally the bread was finished by Friday, and Saturdays and Sundays were particularly bad. My deepest memory of my mother, burned into my brain is a moment when my brother and I were clutching at her skirts, whimpering with hunger. With a sudden jolt, she freed herself, spun round, and she had a face full of an anger and despair that I have never seen before or since. She said perfectly calmly, "Listen, boys, if I could cut it out of my ribs, I would cut it out of my ribs, but I can't, all right." At that moment, we learned not to wail. The so-called culture of complaint disgusts me. Poverty was everywhere, and this didn't strike us as at all unusual, except at certain rare moments. In the village school, which 4 classes taught simultaneously in one room, there were children from poor upland farms that were situated higher up the valley. One of them, Hudson Lewis, was invariably late every single day. I think he had to work in the cowsheds at home before it got light, which always made him late. In winter, he came bombing down the hill on a sleigh, and every day he was covered in snow from head to foot. Class was long since underway. Without a word, dragging the icy sleigh behind him into the classroom, he trudged past Fräulein Hupfauer, our teacher, and every day he had the same explanation. "Miss, I fell off." I don't remember his face, but one day in early summer, when Louis was sitting there in his jacket, which smelled of cowshed, and the teacher told him to take it off because it was far too warm, Louis pretended he didn't hear her. He failed to react to the ever-angrier admonitions of the teacher and finally got a rap on the knuckles with her cane. I have to say that Fräulein Hupfauer was a wonderful person who, in spite of having 4 classes to teach at once, managed to instill knowledge and enthusiasm and curiosity and confidence in her charges. The cane was part of the regular accoutrements of the teacher and bothered no one. To us it was noteworthy that, when we misbehaved, we were made to kneel on the naughty step, and when we misbehaved badly, on a log of wood. Louis was still unwilling to take off his jacket, and all of us in the classroom, perhaps 26 children all told, girls and boys between 6 and 10, started to notice. That made his predicament worse, and he started silently sobbing. The silence of his crying still squeezes my heart today. Finally, Louis took off his jacket. Underneath was the only shirt he owned. It was so worn and ragged that the sleeves hung in tatters off his shoulders. The teacher began to cry too and put the jacket back over him.